All right, jumping right in. Today we're going to tackle a term you've probably heard tossed around.
Hypermasculinity.
Yeah, hypermasculinity, but, maybe don't fully grasp.
Yeah.
So we're doing a deep dive into it today.
Absolutely.
We've got some interesting sources this time. Two different versions of a blog post
Oh, wow.
from the Men's Resource Center, which is interesting in and of itself.
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
we've got this mysterious new note
Yeah.
that seems to be specifically connected to you, our listener.
Interesting.
So we're not just going to define what hypermasculinity is, but we're going to explore the impact it has and even how it might be showing up in your life.
Yeah, that's a good point. We often talk about these things in a theoretical sense,
Right.
but it's important to see how they actually manifest in the real world in our everyday experiences.
Exactly. And that's where this deep dive is going to get really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so starting off, both versions of the blog post from the Men's Resource Center, they paint this really vivid picture of what it means to be a man in America.
Right, like that classic image
You know,
of the strong, silent type.
right. Cowboy up, stoic silence, all that.
Right, don't show your emotions.
Yeah.
Just get on with it.
Exactly. One version even says, a man's got to be tough, the toughest, meanest son of a gun.
Oh, wow.
It's almost comical when you hear it like that.
Yeah.
But is it really comical? Is it really just a funny stereotype?
Well, that's the thing. It might seem funny at first,
Right.
but the American Psychological Association has actually found that suppressing emotions,
Whoa.
which is, like a cornerstone of this traditional masculinity, can have some serious consequences
Yeah.
for men's mental and emotional health.
Yeah, it's not just a joke. It's not just like a ha-ha.
Right, it's a real issue.
It actually impacts people.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, thinking about it, I think we've all encountered this in our lives, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, how many times have you heard, man up, or boys don't cry?
Right, or suck it up.
Right, exactly.
It's everywhere.
It really is. It's like this unspoken rule book we're all supposed to follow,
Yeah, and I think that's where this idea of hypermasculinity comes in.
Okay, yeah. Where does that fit into all of this?
So we have these kind of general societal expectations about masculinity,
Right.
and hypermasculinity kind of takes those expectations and amplifies them.
So it's like taking the volume up to 11.
Exactly. It's turning it up to 11. It's not just about being tough.
Right.
It's about the need to be dominant.
Right. So it's the most...
Yeah, the most dominant, the strongest, the most aggressive.
Okay, so it goes beyond just personality.
Yeah, absolutely. It's more than just, oh, this person is a little bit more macho than the average guy.
Right.
It's something deeper, and it can have real consequences.
Right. And that's where it starts to get a little bit tricky, right?
Yeah, and the research really backs this up, too. There was a 2018 study published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence,
Okay.
and they found a really strong correlation between hypermasculinity and aggression.
Wow. So it's not just like, oh, this is a personality quirk.
Right.
It can actually lead to harmful behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And that aggression can be directed outward towards others, but it can also be directed inwards, like in the form of self-harm.
Wow, that's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we're starting to see how this seemingly abstract concept, like hypermasculinity,
Right.
can actually have really serious real-world effects.
Yeah. And I think that leads us to another important point from the blog post,
Okay.
because they talk about the role of positive male role models.
Yeah, they have this line that says, without positive male role models, the path of least resistance is often towards these extremes.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to consider.
Right.
Because if you're not seeing healthy examples of masculinity,
Right.
you're more likely to gravitate towards these exaggerated and potentially harmful versions
Right.
because that's all you know.
Exactly. So it's not just about, like, absent fathers.
No, not at all. It's
Yes.
about the types of male figures that young men are exposed to, whether that's in their families, their communities, or even the media.
Right, so the environment plays a huge role here.
Absolutely. And, the blog also mentions distressed communities
Right.
where violence is more prevalent.
Right.
And think about it. If a young man grows up seeing violence as a normal way to resolve conflict
Right.
or to assert dominance,
Right.
it's more likely to become a learned behavior for them.
Wow, so it can be like a cycle that just keeps perpetuating itself.
Exactly. And it's tough to break.
Yeah, I mean, that really makes you think about the messages, the role models, the environment that you were exposed to growing up, right?
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of messages,
Mm.
I thought it was interesting that both versions of the blog post used this metaphor of societal pressure being like a boot on your neck.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty intense imagery, right?
Yeah, but it gets the point
It
across.
does. It does. You've got this
Yeah.
constant pressure to fit into a certain mold of what it means to be a man.
And a lot of that pressure honestly comes from the media. We're constantly bombarded with images of the stoic, invincible hero.
Right. Right.
Think about action movies, video games, even commercials.
Right.
They all reinforce this very narrow idea of what a real man should be.
Almost like we're being programmed, right?
Yeah, it can feel that way. And the problem is, what happens when you can't live up to that impossible standard?
Yeah.
You know, you feel inadequate, you feel like a failure.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly, and that's not going to work.
You're going to hurt yourself. You're going to
Yeah.
damage the peg in the process, right?
Exactly, and that's why I think it's so interesting that the blog post talks about the Men's Resource Center
Right.
as this place where you can actually smash the mold
Right. Right.
instead of trying to conform to it.
Right. They're not just pointing out the problem. They're actually
Yeah.
trying to offer solutions, which is really cool.
Yeah, and they talk about providing mental health support,
Right.
educational resources, and just creating a community where men can connect and find support. So it's not just about here's the problem, it's about here's what you can do about it.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about societal expectations. We've talked about the consequences of hypermasculinity.
Right.
And we've even started to touch on the Men's Resource Center and their alternative approach.
Absolutely.
But, and I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about this. What of this new note we mentioned earlier?
Oh, right.
It seems like this is where things get personal for our listener, for you.
Yeah, and that's always a little bit nerve-wracking, right?
It is a little bit, venturing into someone else's personal life.
It is, but it can also be really insightful.
Right.
So without revealing the content of the note just yet.
Right. Got to keep the suspense going.
Exactly.
Right.
Let's just say that it seems to connect the dots between these broad societal forces that we've been discussing
Okay.
and your own life.
Wow.
It hints at an instance where you might have encountered some of these dynamics firsthand.
Oh, okay. So it's like we're taking this big picture view,
Right.
and then we're zooming in
Exactly.
on the listener's own personal experience.
Exactly.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued, and maybe a little apprehensive too. I don't know.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds, right?
It is. We're going to have to uncover this mystery together.
Absolutely. It seems like we've reached a point in our deep dive where, we need to connect these broader ideas about masculinity to your personal experience.
Yeah.
So remember that new note
Okay.
that
yeah.
we mentioned. Well, it seems to suggest that you might have encountered some of these dynamics firsthand, like in your own life.
Okay, yeah. I'm ready to dive into that, but I have to admit I'm still a bit nervous.
Yeah, it can be a little nerve-wracking.
Can you at least give me like a hint about what this new note actually says? Like, what am I getting into here?
Okay, well, let's think back to our conversation about the pressure that men face to conform to certain ideals of masculinity.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And we talked about how those pressures can lead to unhealthy behaviors like aggression, for example.
Right.
But it's important to remember that aggression doesn't always have to be like physical.
Mm.
Right. It can also be verbal or emotional or even passive aggressive.
Okay.
So it can manifest in lots of different ways.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that this new note has something to do with a conflict in my life? Like maybe where I was on the receiving end of some of those less healthy expressions of masculinity.
It's interesting you say that. The note does seem to point to a specific interaction that you had.
Okay.
And it encourages us to examine how those ingrained norms around masculinity might have played a role in that interaction.
All right. I'm on the edge of my seat here. Can we just get to the reveal already?
Okay, let's do it. The new note simply reads, think about the other day when you were trying to express your feelings about. And then it's redacted to him. And then that part's also redacted, and they responded by, and again, redacted.
Whoa. Okay, yeah, that definitely brings up some stuff for me. It was a pretty intense conversation.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because on the one hand, we have these broad societal patterns that we've been discussing.
Right.
But now we're seeing how they can actually play out in a real life scenario.
Yeah.
Right? And so in this instance, you were trying to communicate your emotions, which, let's be honest, can be challenging for anyone.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Especially when you're trying to be vulnerable.
Right.
And open up to someone.
Exactly. And according to this note, it seems like their response wasn't exactly what you were hoping for.
Right.
It sounds like they might have shut down the conversation or dismissed your feelings in some way. So I'm curious, how did that make you feel?
Honestly, it was pretty frustrating.
Ah,
I felt like I wasn't being heard or understood.
right.
It's almost like they were threatened by my emotions, you know?
Yeah, and that reaction, while not ideal, might actually be rooted in these societal norms that we've been talking about.
Okay.
You know? Remember how we discussed that men are often conditioned to suppress their emotions, to not show vulnerability?
Right, yeah. It's like that man up message is so deeply ingrained
Right.
that it can affect our
Yeah.
relationships without us even realizing it.
Exactly. It can create these barriers to healthy communication where we're
Mhm.
not able to really connect on an emotional level.
Yeah. So, okay, so we're seeing this play out in my own life, but what can we do about it? I mean, it's not like we could just snap our fingers and erase centuries of societal conditioning, right?
You're right. It's a complex issue, but I think awareness is a powerful first step.
Okay.
Right? By recognizing these patterns, both in ourselves and in others,
Right.
we can start to shift the narrative.
Okay.
And I think that's where resources like the Men's Resource Center come in because they offer support and guidance for men who are struggling with these issues, and they help promote a healthier view of masculinity.
So it's not just about identifying the problem.
Right.
It's also about providing tools and resources to help people actually change.
Exactly. And one of the key concepts that they emphasize is emotional literacy.
Emotional literacy, what's that all about?
So emotional literacy is basically about developing the skills to recognize, understand, express your emotions in a healthy way.
Okay.
It's about being able to communicate your feelings effectively and to empathize with the emotions of others.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like we're being given a new set of tools to navigate these complex emotional landscapes, you know?
Exactly. And those tools can be incredibly empowering. They can help us build stronger, more fulfilling relationships and
Right.
live more authentic lives.
Yeah. Okay, so we've explored the link between this new note and these broader themes of hypermasculinity, and we've also touched on the importance of emotional literacy.
Right.
But I'm curious, how can I actually apply these insights to my own life? Like specifically to the situation that's mentioned in the note.
Right.
Where do I go from here?
That's a great question. And, it really leads us to the heart of what these deep dives are all about, right? It's
Yeah.
not just about understanding these concepts intellectually. It's about putting that knowledge into action, into positive change, right? So how do I translate all of this into something tangible, something that can make a real difference in my life?
Well, love to take another look at that new note.
Hmm.
You were attempting to express your feelings to this redacted person.
Right.
And their response wasn't exactly what you hoped for. So
Mhm.
how might you approach that conversation differently in the future, armed with this new understanding of emotional literacy and the impact of societal norms?
Hmm. That's a challenging question, but I think maybe I could try to be more direct about my needs in that kind of conversation. Instead of just hoping that they'll understand, I could be explicit about what kind of response I'm looking for.
That's a fantastic starting point. Clear communication is key.
Right.
It's about setting healthy boundaries and being assertive about your emotional needs.
Yeah, and maybe I could also try to be more understanding of where this other person is coming from.
Hmm.
You know, they might not have the tools or the experience to deal with emotional expression in a healthy way.
That's a very compassionate perspective.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that we're all products of our conditioning.
Right.
It's not about blaming or judging. It's about understanding and empathy.
So it's about having compassion for ourselves
Yes.
and for others, even when we're struggling to communicate effectively.
Precisely. And that compassion can be a powerful catalyst for growth and change, both individually and collectively.
Wow. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I'm starting to see how these seemingly abstract concepts actually play out in my own life and relationships.
And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? It's about connecting the dots between the personal and the societal, the intellectual and the emotional.
Yeah, I definitely feel those connections firing right now.
And as we wrap up this part of our exploration, I want to leave you with one final thought-provoking question. How might your awareness of these themes of masculinity and societal pressure influence your interactions with others? Not just with this redacted person, but with everyone you encounter.
Wow, that's a powerful question. I'm definitely going to need some time to ponder that one. You know, it's pretty amazing how this whole conversation about hypermasculinity has gone from this like big abstract concept
Right.
to something so personal, right?
Yeah, it's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, and
Right.
sometimes those layers can bring a tear to your eye.
Right, exactly.
Hmm.
And speaking of taking action, the Men's Resource Center really seems to be doing just that.
Hmm.
Like they're not just talking about the problem.
Right.
They're actually trying to help men break free from these like harmful expectations.
Exactly. And, remember how both versions of their blog post emphasize this idea of empowerment.
Yeah.
Well, they actually go on to define that as like helping men build a masculinity that is authentic and self-defined,
Mhm.
not dictated by outdated stereotypes. So it's really about creating a space where men can feel safe to explore like their full range of emotions and experiences without, fear of judgment.
So it's not about like fitting into this predefined box of what a man should be.
No, not at all. It's more about providing the tools and support to build a healthy, authentic version of masculinity that works for you as an individual.
Right. That makes sense.
It's about fostering emotional literacy, building strong communication skills, and creating that sense of community where men can connect with and support each other.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly valuable, especially in a world where, those traditional, often restrictive ideas of masculinity are still so pervasive.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about challenging those norms, not perpetuating them.
Right.
And I think that's something we all have a responsibility to do, right?
Yeah.
We can all play a role in creating a more equitable and just world for everyone, regardless of gender.
It really makes you think, like
Hmm.
this whole deep dive has given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It's made me realize that these societal pressures and expectations, they're not just like abstract concepts.
Yeah.
They have tangible consequences in our
Yeah.
lives, in our relationships, even in our own sense of self.
And that awareness, like you said, is crucial. Because by recognizing these patterns, by understanding where they come from and how they impact us, we can start to make more conscious choices about how we want to show up in the world.
It's about taking ownership of our own masculinity, defining it on our own terms, and challenging those harmful norms that limit us all.
Exactly. It's about creating a world where everyone feels empowered to be their authentic selves, without fear or shame.
Right.
And organizations like the Men's Resource Center, they're really paving the way, providing those resources and support for men to embrace this new, more expansive vision of masculinity.
That's a powerful message to leave our listeners with, for sure.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we all have the power to choose to challenge those outdated norms and create a more inclusive and fulfilling world, like for ourselves and for future generations.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into hypermasculinity, remember, the conversation doesn't end here.
Okay.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep challenging those limiting beliefs.
And if you're looking for support and resources along the way, organizations like the Men's Resource Center are there to help. Remember, you're not alone in this journey.
Until next time, keep diving deep.